Welcome to the place where we learn about and learn from the leaders in our field who are powering creativity. I'm Aaron Dworkin, and this is Arts Engines. Just a heads up, everyone, that my new book, Lessons in Gratitude, a memoir on race, the arts, and mental health, published by the University of Michigan Press, is now available on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for joining me here on Arts Engines. Today's guest is Robert McGrath, who serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's wonderful to be here today.
Well, so I'm always so excited to talk with you. There's obviously so many exciting things that are always going on with the CSO and one of our amazing creative partners. But I thought today, because it's so relevant, especially to everyone in our audience who's related to the orchestral world, but also beyond, because different types of contracts and things like that exist all across our industry and our field. But that specifically relates to the collective bargaining agreement that the CSO has reached successfully with their musicians. And obviously your leadership role, you're a cornerstone, a key part of that process. And so first, I just was hoping to just kind of ask you in terms of overall approach, and then I'd like to get into some details of what was incorporated in that, especially as it relates to kind of DEI type of work. But just in terms of negotiations, right? So many people in the industry have to engage in these types of things where sometimes people feel like there's opposing sides and all of that. You came to this wonderful and amazing, successful conclusion. And just wondering, from your role, do you feel like there were any one or two things that you kind of approached the process with that helped lead to that success? Were there any strategic approaches or an ethos to the process that you think really coming forth is, this is a best practice for this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in general, I would say we're an organization that is guided very much by a clear strategic plan and a culture of mutual problem solving. That's fostered in large part because the important discussions do not wait for collective bargaining to commence every 3 to 5 years. We, with our musician leadership, with our board leadership, are in constant conversation so that collective bargaining becomes more the culmination of problem solving rather than the commencement. And that is particularly relevant to some of the outcomes that we'll be talking about or highlighting regarding some DEI outcomes regarding equitable audition and tenure processes. Because, for instance, we had a DEI task force that was formalized and adopted in the last collective bargaining agreement, and that's been meeting regularly for the better part of the last 4 years and laying the groundwork for some of the achievements in this round of collective bargaining.
Absolutely. And I, of course, love that either the problems are already have been discussed, talked about, and ideally solved leading into the process rather than, oh, let's just put everything off wait
Right.
and then calamitous, adversarial discussion. So wonderful approach. So as you referenced, right, DEI being incorporated into the collective bargaining agreement, and specifically, of course, there are some national programs, NAS and SOPA, relating to Sphinx, and then also BOND that we can refer to, which is the Black Orchestral Network, and some of their best practices. And so wonder if you could kind of just talk about NAS, SOPA, and how you view that and how that was able to be incorporated for both the administration and the musicians.
Yeah, so, well, maybe I'll just describe briefly what I think are the major outcomes with respect to DEI from this collective bargaining agreement. So we've dramatically evolved our musician audition and tenure processes to yield a host of contractual and policy provisions that focus on transparency, on equity, and on support mechanisms. And all of these outcomes are consistent with best practices and recommendations that were put forth to the field within the last year plus by the two national service organizations that you referenced, the National Alliance for Audition Support and the Black Orchestral Network. We believe we're the first American orchestra to adopt the full breadth of recommendations put forward by the Black Orchestral Network with respect to equitable tenure practices. So we're really hoping that this is going to serve as a catalyst for positive change, not just with respect to the culture internally for the CSO and the diversity of our musicians in the long term, but also hopefully serve as a catalyst for change in the field. And there's three key outcomes I would highlight just real briefly, and then we can unpack whatever you think is beneficial. The first, and I think the most groundbreaking, is that we are creating and implementing a formal evaluation process for musicians during the tenure process that's based on written job-related criteria. The second is the increase of support mechanisms for musicians during the tenure process. And then third is the implementation of protections against conflicts of interest during audition and tenure processes.
Fantastic. And so in looking at those, was there one of them that kind of stood out either in terms of its importance or the resulting impact? And how, as obviously someone in leadership, will you be able to monitor to make sure that these best practices are ultimately carried out, especially as I think about that last component in terms of conflicts of interest?
Yeah. Well, so in terms of the conflicts of interest, this is something that will be part of an ongoing dialogue. So we are implementing, for instance, everyone who serves on an audition committee is going to need to fill out, just as if you were joining a board, a form that identifies any potential or perceived conflicts of interest. The collective bargaining agreement is very specific to familial, dating, romantic relationships, but we've been intentionally non-specific just because the culture that we have here, we believe that there's no way to hypothesize every single scenario that might unfold and present a conflict of interest. So we will work out and hold ourselves accountable in conversation with musician leadership about how to adapt to situations in real time. I think the most meaningful thing really is what I referenced earlier in terms of the implementation of a system of evaluation for musicians who are under the 2-year review process to receive tenure that's based on these written job-related criteria. Probably for any listener that works in another field, this would be like a baseline foundation of just how your job performance is evaluated, but we work in a very subjective, qualitative field, and believe it or not, it's been harder, I think, historically, to arrive at just even the concept that there would be concrete criteria, a rubric even, which we will be implementing based on those criteria that are used to evaluate people's performance. And this is important because we're talking not just about musical criteria, but also about those very hard to articulate cultural values of culture fit and leadership qualities of a section. And when you wind up with systems as we have historically that are opaque, not even clear, or often even articulated to the musicians about what's expected of them, we know that historically musicians of color and women are much more susceptible to bias in that process. So it's our expectation that by implementing something much more formal, much more concrete, that will be able to really create much more objectivity in the process, and that equity, frankly, will benefit every member of the orchestra.
Absolutely. And I love that component, right? And it seems like all of this is just leading to ultimately fairness and equity, and when various decisions are made, that there is just so much more added transparency, understanding, and written shared understanding as opposed to just verbal, which I think is fantastic. And so obviously a lot of these relate and are relating to musicians who are in the orchestra and who are, then looking at promotion and tenure. Any kind of aspects leading to initial auditions and entering the orchestra that you think really are foundational, and will have a significant impact?
Yeah. I mean, two key outcomes from this is that we've achieved the ability to pre-advance musicians who are winners from the Sphinx Orchestral partner auditions directly to the semifinal round of auditions, so that we can ensure that we have a much more diverse candidate pool at each step of the process. And that's something that in our case has been validated by, and something that we were quite comfortable adopting, because our musicians have regularly been attending and adjudicating the SOPA auditions for the last few years, and are quite well aware of and supportive of the quality, the amazing musicians that are part of that process. The same is true of the musicians who are part of our fellowship program, that is based on their experience, that they will, and the quality of those musicians, that they will also be pre-advanced. And then the other one I would say is that conflict of interest outcome that I was referencing earlier, which is equally important in the audition process. For instance, something as basic as a musician who has auditioned for a position previously cannot serve on the jury to award the position or to award tenure to someone for that same position that they were pursuing themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's so interesting too, because some of these things, it seems, in this evolutionary process, and then when we see the impact of them, it's like, oh, we should have been doing this for years, that kind of thing. And so but that can be a real affirmation that it's the correct work to do. Well, this is absolutely groundbreaking. And as you mentioned, one of the first in the country to be able to really incorporate some of these things. And so I am sure that there'll be those in our audience who might be reaching out and saying, can we look at some of these structures so we can explore implementing it in our own orchestra. So unfortunately, we are just about out of time. We could be talking about this for hours, and I definitely encourage anyone in the orchestra, in our audience, to reach out to the CSO, and especially to Robert, given this work that they've done. But just my last question, I always like to ask of my guests, as you do this work, it is certainly not always easy, especially negotiations, and especially complex aspects where there's a lot on the line. And just wondering, as an administrative leader, are there any best practices that you utilize when times are tough or you've got to get through, potentially insurmountable obstacles?
Yeah. Two things come to mind. One, important for me to every day take a little personal reflection time, whether that's just walking outside and getting some sunlight for 15 minutes, or walking around my neighborhood and getting some exercise at the end of a long day, and just allowing the synapses to rejuvenate. The other is quite honestly, it's still foundational to why I've been in the industry, which is just to go to performances. I mean, I always draw energy from, whether it's a full orchestra, like the CSO, or hearing colleagues, other art forms, et cetera. I just draw so much from that collective experience, and being able to, especially at the end of a long week, just reconnect with the music that draws my passion for being in this field in the first place. I draw just tremendous inspiration from that, weekly.
It truly is incredible work. Robert McGrath, you truly are one of the arts engines who is powering human creativity in our world. Thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Aaron. Pleasure.
Just a heads up, everyone, that my new book, Lessons in Gratitude, a memoir on race, the arts, and mental health, published by the University of Michigan Press, is now available on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. I encourage you to check it out.